Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Glenn Tifford, co-director of the Hoover project and program on the US, China, and the world. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Elisabeth Paté-Cornell from the Management Science and Engineering Department here at Stanford, who's going to talk to us a little bit about quantitative risk analysis, giving us a numbers-free introduction to the method. Dr. Paté-Cornell is the Burt and Dee Dee McMurtry Professor in the School of Engineering here at Stanford and a member of the National Academy of Engineering. She currently co-chairs the National Academy's Committee on Risk Analysis Methods for Nuclear War and Nuclear Terrorism, and really has spent a career specializing in engineering risk analysis applied to complex systems. Elisabeth, thank you very much for joining us today, and I want to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Glenn. Well, I've worked in many different fields, and by the way, this risk analysis for nuclear war is the project is over, and I'm no longer chairing it. But I'm delighted to be here and to tell you what I've been doing at Stanford for many decades. So, risk analysis in an uncertain world. I'm going to show you the method and a few numbers, but not too many. It's a good alternative to the wet finger in a way. And that it's the dose that makes the poison. That means it's the intensity of the risk that makes the risk. So what is it? Bad events? Scenarios are what matters. For example, the loss of a plane. It's the probability in a given time horizon. You always have to say the probability when, and their outcomes. Let me tell you about the examples that I will tell you about at the end of my talk. Medicine, patient risk in anesthesia. Engineering, I'll tell you about the risk of spacecraft loss and the work that I've done on the shuttle. Defense, risk of an insurgency in the Philippines in this case. And cyber risk analysis, most of this work with my doctoral students, whom I enjoyed very much. So I would say quantitative risk analysis is a good decision support because it addresses things like probabilistic dependencies and priorities that the qualitative risk analysis do not in general. We use Bayesian probability and not only statistics. Why? Because I very often have relevant statistics in my work. And Bayesian probability is based on all available information. And I give you one equation in this talk. The probability of A and B is the probability of A multiplied by that of B given A. So B given A, the probability may be close to 1 or close to 0. So it's not the probability of A multiplied by that of B. Accounts for probability dependencies, you see it here, when a system or the process involves correlated events and dependencies, which is very important. For example, some perfect storms, they're not independent, and the perfect storm of 91 on the East Coast was among the storms that were not totally independent. The results of my risk analysis are probability distribution of the outcomes, that is, the chances of different loss levels. But note, the risk is not the product of the losses by their probability, as it's often believed. You have to consider all the scenarios and the extreme events. How does one do it? First, understand the system or the process. How should it work? How might it fail? And what are the chances that failure happens in the time horizon and how to prevent it? Beware of guesstimates and don't predict anything. Assess the scenario, the risk considering all the imaginable failure scenarios, even the least likely. So don't dump things that you think are unlikely. Don't pick the most likely hypothesis and present it to the boss as if you were sure of it, which happens all the time. Let me now show you the general risk analysis model. First, the failure scenarios. And I'm talking about classes of scenarios because we don't want to get into excruciatingly complicated details. Identifications include the conjunctions of events, technical failures, human errors, and external events. External events are very important. For example, the earthquakes on my house, and the future evolution of the risk. Now, the probabilities of these scenarios per time unit of operation, now in the future, including, again, the dependencies and external events, and the consequences of the different failure scenarios, including these extreme events, with very large or very small probabilities. You don't dump them because they are at the end of the distribution. Now let's talk about decisions and risk management. So risk management then involves decisions under uncertainties and the risk attitude. Are you risk prone? Are you risk averse? Or risk indifferent? That's where artificial intelligence might be critical, because artificial intelligence often gives you a suggestion for a decision. And in that suggestion, in their model, they have a risk attitude, except you don't know what it is. And sometimes it's not yours. And there's a problem of alignment that has to be addressed, something that people are trying very hard to do. So, but that means that you need to have access to the software risk attitude, and you have some flexibility in the AI system to change their solution. Next question, don't start from the data that you have, but the information that you need. I've heard very often we can't do it because we don't have the information. Well, look for it, but don't give me the wrong result just because you are using the data that you have without knowing what else you don't know. And more than an important thing, don't do a risk analysis for someone who doesn't want to hear the result or wants to tell you what to find. And I've been there, done that, and told them no. Let's go now to the data sources, because I've heard many times, oh, you can't do a risk analysis because you don't have the data. Well, I have a lot of information. The actual data and statistics. Sometimes I have statistics, and I'm happy when that's the case. Test data, for example, testing a structure on a seismic table that we have here in a risk analysis system. I've been on it, and it's interesting. You can test structures. Surrogate data about similar subsystems in other systems. Expert opinions, engineering or social science models, for example, behaviors. Expert opinions, now you have to choose well your expert as a function of their specialty and how good they are. For example, you're a doctor, and you have to believe your doctor, or no, you have to change your doctor if you don't, and a flight engineer. Now, one often does a risk analysis because there are no relevant statistics. So you need information versus the existing data. For new systems, in particular, I do a lot of work in space. And in space, very often we have first systems that have never flown, and you have to use all the existing data. Now, we have two kinds of risk analysis results. The probability of failure, or the probability distribution of the outcomes. That means what is the probability of exceeding different levels of losses to the absolute end. Okay, now when you have several actors involved, you have a game problem, and you have to simulate a game. So example of a conflict. Simulation of a game, I'm going to show you an example of government versus insurgents. And assessment of the country's situation and stability is the consequence of what's going to happen in that conflict. So the decision is the one for the government, for example, to fight now versus later. And the result is the probability of reaching and maintaining power and the threshold of stability or other situations in the country in a given time horizon. And then I'm going to present you 4 cases. Case number 1, patient risk in anesthesia, and I'll be happy to hear your comments if you are in the medical field. I've spent 2 days in operating rooms and did a lot of work with Professor Gaba, was very, very helpful. Study context, anesthesia risks only, and what we're concerned about is death or brain damage. We look only at healthy patients in large urban hospitals. What I mean by that, for example, knee surgery. And the base rate of risk of severe harm in anesthesia in this country, and in fact in Australia, where I got a lot of data, and other places, is in the order of 1 in 10,000. What is the goal of our project? To apply risk analysis techniques to anesthesia, to identify the risk management roots of human errors, because of course, we're going to see that a lot of the problems in anesthesia are human errors. It's very seldom the machines that do not work. Develop and evaluate policy recommendations, and I'm going to show you some of those and the benefits that we evaluated. Now, this is an accident sequence that I need to explain. You have a time axis in red in the middle. Above it, the evolution of the anesthesia system. Under it, the evolution of the patient. And what starts this problem is an oxygen tube disconnect. So I look at my time axis and the management of incidents by the anesthesia team. First, disconnect. Then the tube disconnect. We don't do it because we want to. Then it takes a while for the team to detect the problem. Then once it's detected, to correct the problem. Meanwhile, your patient is doing fine in the first phase, is deteriorating in the second phase because the patient doesn't get oxygen at that point, turns blue. And that's how you immediately figure out what's going on. And then after you have corrected the problem, the patient recovers, hopefully. So the data sources that I got here was an Australian database. The chairman of Anesthesia at Adelaide had all kinds of data that he gave me nicely. The expert opinions to see what's happening after that in subsequent events. I got expert opinions for surgeon anesthetists, but most importantly from nurses. The nurses, particularly the experienced older nurses who had seen it all, gave me a lot of information. But I also had national statistics with a global base rate. And here is what we computed, the results. Computed benefits of changing of management policies, because what we wanted to do is to change management policies to improve the anesthetist's performance. That is, to decrease the probability of initiating events and accelerate the accident resolutions, make them more competent. So what did we look at? Formal, regular recertification. And we assessed the benefits at reducing the risk by 23 to 29%. Now, the anesthetists did not like the idea because they were not too happy about the idea of a formal regulation recertification. Simulation training, which is in fact part of the previous one, 16%. But then the one that I'm most interested in, the strict supervision of all residents, 14% reduction of the risk. This one is the one that I've talked the most about because I think that it's easy to do, but it takes good supervision and people being there and paying attention. So my conclusions on the anesthesia study, the actual risk was not what motivated that study, which was alcohol, drugs, and age. We were called after there was an accident because someone had drunk too much. But what we found, it was much more, how can I say, it's fatigue, distraction, and insufficient knowledge. They didn't know what they were doing. For some anesthesiologists, particularly some older people who had forgotten things that they had not seen since they had graduated. Okay, so to reduce the risk, we made recommendations to improve the management of anesthetists. For example, managing the residents, older practitioners, and the coherence of the OR team, although that one is pretty good. The time on simulator that should reduce the probabilities of errors and the time to detection and correction. I was told by the British that I was overestimating the benefits of the time on simulators, but I think that it's because they really did not, they were not too enthusiastic about the idea. Okay, so that was anesthesia. And now for something entirely different. We're getting into the world of space. And I've done a lot of work with NASA. And my first study was on a heat shield of the space shuttle, which they asked me to do a long time ago. Now, that was a long time ago, but the problem is exactly the same as I'm going to show you for systems that exist right now, in particular the one that moves around Jupiter and needs to be protected against radiations as well as heat. Okay, what's the shielding problem? Well, first, the mathematical model structure. It's a two-dimensional surface, the shuttle, surface of the orbiter, a partition according to the values of the loads, in this case the heat, and the capacities of the different parts to take that heat. Okay, so the heat, for example, is particularly high in the nose of the spacecraft. Okay, the objective is to protect the spacecraft at takeoff. We have it. Next. So the shielding problem. We have a two-dimensional surface, as I said, protecting the spacecraft at takeoff for the heat at re-entry and in flight from the brain radiations. Now, same problem, the radiation shielding for your back clipper which is an orbiter around Jupiter that they have just launched. Exactly the same problem. The risk analysis study for the tiles that I did with Paul Fischbeck, the objective was to compute the contribution of the tiles to the overall failure risk of a shuttle mission and to identify the most risk critical tiles. I asked the astronauts how they felt about the tiles. They did not like the idea of being protected by tiles glued on the surface. But you're going to see, in fact, it was pretty good. And assess the effect of the management and procedures between flights. The tiles have to be fixed. There are 25,000 of them, and I've spent some time with them at Kennedy Space Center, and it's a lot of work. And you don't let things loose if you can fix them. So then assess the effect of the management and the procedures of this maintenance system and make recommendations to NASA, which we did. So our study was based on the first 37 flights, and our focus was the management of the maintenance. As I said, the same problem with heat and radiation. So here is what it looked like. So the first time I saw that from under the shuttle, I thought, holy smokes, how am I going to address that problem? And I decided to focus on 4 parameters. The density of the debris hits in different parts of the shuttle, the aerodynamic forces that influence the loss of adjacent tiles if we have already lost one, the heat loads that needs to burn through the skin of the orbiter, and the criticality of the subsystems under the skin if they are exposed to these hot gases. Okay, by putting all these maps one on top of the others, we obtained what I call the min zones, minimum zones, with similar parameter values, and we could compute the probability distribution of the number of gaps in the heat shield, that is the number of first tiles lost, then on the whole surface, and then the probability distribution of the gap size and a hole in the skin, and then computed the probability of failure due to the black tiles failures. Sources of data, we had statistics, density of debris hits, number of tiles that were found to be without bond during maintenance. I got that from the technicians, a lot of beers in the bars of Cocoa Beach, I can tell you, to get all the stories of the mistakes they were making and how they were cutting corners, things that they are not going to tell you on the job. And the heat load and aerodynamic force measurements. And I got statistics from Johnson Space Center, a very nice gentleman who gave me all the information he had. Expert opinions I needed to get the probability of losing the orbiter if specified subsystems under the skin were exposed to hot gases. And uncertainties about the estimates. Now we made consistent use of average of probabilities. Now the distribution will be for the next study. Conclusion and main results of the technical analysis. The tiles contributed about 10% of the total failure risk. There is 1 in 1,000 per mission. 15% of the tiles contributed 85% of the rest. So don't mess up these 15%. Doesn't mean that you have to mess up the others. 12 tiles were found without bond and holding by the edges to gap fillers. And what we told NASA, among other things, was to relax the maintenance time constraints, to adjust the technician salaries. They were not paid as much as some of the other technicians, so they would be moving to another position, and reinforce the external tank shielding. Why? Because it's that external tank that had also the same reinforcement, the same maintenance, same protection, and the same shielding. But NASA did not do that. And that's how we got the Columbia accident. And I had to testify, in fact, after the Columbia accident, based on that study, why is it that they didn't do what you said? Well, sir, your guess is as good as mine. I don't know. Okay, so that was the tiles. Case number 3, risk of an insurgency. And that's a very interesting one. We picked an insurgency in Mindanao, in the Philippines, and Colonel Cusick, who was working with me on his thesis, went there and spent quite a lot of time, got a lot of help from the Philippine army and the US army. And the problem was government versus insurgents. And what would be the effectiveness of the risk analysis measures taken by the government. So what is the risk of different levels of insurgencies for the next 3 years? We did the study in 2007, and we studied the time, 3 years, starting in 2000, as if we did not know what was happening, so that we could test our model. And so it was a retrospective analysis in 2007 to check the results against reality for 3 years, 2000 to 2003. So a counterinsurgency strategic game. The actors, a government and insurgent group, both of them want to have power. An alternate game model with objective function whose values depend on the system state. And the risk measure was the probability that at the end of 3 years, 2000 to 2003, the system stability was still below an acceptable threshold. And we could compare the model results against the reality. So we had two linked inference diagrams representing the decisions of the government and the insurgents at each time unit in months. And the output of one became the input to the next. An inference diagram, if I have not said it, are networks of uncertain variables with their dependencies. So we used the probabilities and the utilities for the insurgents as assessed by the government based on intelligence information. And again, the utility is the degree of satisfaction. The main factor, again, was the utility function on both sides and what do they want. Let me tell you what I've put here on that figure. Let's start at one, the population security. And that's what the government knows when at that time unit, they're going to make a decision. That influences the insurgents' resources. That in turn influences their ability to disrupt and influences the government intelligence, if the government intelligence has been well arranged, and the government decision and action, and the outcome of the action and the utility level at the end. Okay, so government wants to keep the authority. The resource allocation, they have two sets of options with different time horizon. Immediate actions to address insurgency attacks, patrols, protections, and government attacks. And long-term measures to address the fundamental problems that fuel the insurgency, infrastructure, education, healthcare, and the like. On the other hand, so what do they care about? The population situation, the population security level in particular. So we measured it by the number of actionable human intelligence tips that were received by the government in the past 3 months, divided by the number of insurgent attack initiatives. That's the best way we found to do that, to measure that security level. So then the success in counterinsurgency in combat operations and precision of counterinsurgency. Now, on the other side, the general strategic options, launching an attack, organizing civil disobedience, seeking a lasting peace. Their multi-attribute utility function, that is the satisfaction level, for example, the population, economic and social situation, and that affected the ability of the insurgents to disrupt the government. And they too wanted power. So these are curves that represent along the time axis for 3 years the utility of the leaders and the insurgents following a particular policy strategy of the government. And if you see the distribution, in fact, the mean is roughly the same. And the government, the insurgents leader utility and the government leader utility is the same. That means that there was no real challenge for that policy. So the result, the probability distribution of government utility value for this particular case, the starting point in 2000, the utility was 0.203, and the ending point 3 years later, 0.206. There was not much improvement. Now, the reality was around the medians of the results, so we were not very far off. And the benefits of this kind of long-term analysis was important because it provides a balance to an inclination to focus only on the short term. And it's a way to look at the long-term way of doing things. So now, for the last case, cyber risk, again, something entirely different. My model structure is a combination of two data-driven models that I'm going to show to you, a statistical analysis with statistical analysis on one hand, and scenarios and probabilistic model on the other hand. And the example is based on the case of a NASA center that we call here the Space Corp, although it's a JPL. And their concern was lost and stolen computers, a problem that they had quite a while. This is a general cyber risk model and a Bayesian network to be read from the top to the bottom. So the actors, cyber attackers, the cyber defenders, the insiders, and cyber attacker groups. Then the attack itself, the target vulnerability, the target scenario, which is penetration, navigation, extraction, and use of information. What they are trying to do is to get some information from the system of the defenders in this particular case. And at the end, the consequences to the defender, given the countermeasures that they have taken. So we have two distinct kinds of cyber attacks. The operational, routine attacks on the organizational systems, for which statistics may have been gathered. And most often, it's most of the cost of the cyber risk in that particular case. But then, the catastrophic, destructive attacks that may not have happened, but threaten the organization and requires an in-depth analysis of attack scenarios. How can they get in our system? This may be fuzzy, but the data and the analysis are different. So we did statistical data and used expert opinions to initialize the probabilistic model for Space Corp, that is JPL. We focused on the loss of stolen devices, mostly laptops, countermeasures, reporting on incidents, but the effect of the rate loss of computers was mostly due to reporting guidelines, was not due, yes, it was due to the reporting guidelines and encryption. The effect in this case, large incidents did not occur after full disk encryption was implemented, which was, I think, interesting. Yet the overall rate of lost devices was remarkably consistent over time. So this is an empirical analysis. They give us all the incident data over a time axis, the number of hours that it took to analyze each of those. And you can see at the top some really nasty stuff, at the bottom very, very mild incidents. Here I'm fixing on the website. The website is in purple on this. And what I get here is the yearly cost as a function of the probability of the probability of exceeding the given cost. And as you can see, the website is not particularly, how can I say, sensitive in the beginning. But when we get to the high cost, low probability, we are at the upper end. We have no statistics of what an attack of the website at the high cost would be. So we had to devise, so yeah, every so often they can be huge. We have to combine data-driven statistical models and scenario analysis and probability. What you see on the right side is a risk curve, the probability of exceeding given losses. We look first at the domain on the left side, on the upper side, where we have statistics because we have seen attacks. Then the scenarios of some severe impact incidents that have not happened yet are on the right side, and we have to do a model, and we plug the two models by an overlap model to see what the whole thing is going to look like, particularly for these large incidents that we want to focus on. And this is one example of a cyber attack that we put on an event tree. Is there an attack or no attack? If we have an attack, is it email or website, which is what they were most concerned about? If it's email, is there an infection of the whole system? If there is an infection, are the administrative credentials obtained? And if that's the case, is the intellectual property stolen? And what are the effects at the end of the event tree? So, takeaways of this cyber study. Risk quantification with incomplete data sets can be done by combining the statistical analysis of past attacks and a probabilistic scenario analysis of attack sequences. We use expert opinions and examples of close calls for the attacks that have not occurred yet, and we need to identify the system structure and what we call the crown jewels. Now, the countermeasure effectiveness can be assessed and compared, and in this case, as I mentioned earlier, the full disk encryption and two-factor authentication were shown to be most effective, and that's the general result, I think. So, my conclusions and the challenges that I've seen. Risk analysis is an essential support of decision analysis under uncertainty. The challenge is first to recognize what we know and what we don't about the fundamental mechanisms and the problem formulation, making it manageable. Gathering and processing incomplete information. That means talking to people and go to the work site. I went to the work site of each of the studies that I did. Spent time in operating rooms, which was a very interesting experience, by the way, and spent time also in the space system maintenance at Kennedy Space Center. And then communicating the results, particularly when you communicate probability and the results and the uncertainties, and following up if feasible. And I did follow up in several of these studies, went back if my study had been understood, and if they had used it, and if not, why, and if there was something missing, I would be glad to tell them. And if perception is reality, our goal is to inject reality into perception. Because I'm told very often, the risk is the perception of the risk. No, the perception is the perception, but the risk doesn't have to be the perception. And if you want the risk analysis, I'll do it for you. I sometimes say for a good price. So that's my story.
Well, thank you, Elisabeth, very much. While our audience formulates their questions, and in particular, I want to invite the Zoom audience to file questions using the Q&A button on the screen for them. I thought I'd maybe start by priming a couple of questions of my own. As you know, the discourse on the U.S.-China relationship these days is really dominated by discussions about risk. We've moved, I think, into a new phase. Risk of war, risk of losing the AI competition, risk of, well, you name it, everything. There's a lot we can adopt from the probabilistic methods, I think, that you described to make our risk analysis in these domains more rigorous. But let me start with a more basic question. Hoover has a wargaming and crisis simulation initiative here. And as you know, war games or similar simulations and tabletop exercises have long been used to model complex cases and crisis situations. The business world uses scenario planning exercises to do forecasting in similar ways. Quant firms have their own models for how a stock or an economy will perform. Can you compare or contrast the methods that you're describing here to those other methods, which your methods, I imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, have their foundations in engineering. Some of the others come from social sciences. Are they suited to different use cases? Do they have different strengths or weaknesses? That's my first question.
Well, the model that I present is, in fact, a general model. As you have seen, it applies to medicine, it applies to space, it applies, and the question is always the same one. What are the scenarios? And in the China problem, you're going to have that first question. That's what you're working on. By what scenarios could we get into the kind of war that you're concerned about? Second question, of course, is how can we disrupt these scenarios to make sure it doesn't happen? And in all these scenarios, we look for these events that we can affect. to manage the risk. And after that, we do our best with our resources. And the question of resources is time, it's money, it's what people want, it's what people can do. And I would say the leaders are part of the resources as well in some cases. So, and then we do the best we can with what we have. And as time passes, we have to move fast to act as fast as we can and do the right thing.
Okay. My second question is that I think we're also at a moment now where potentially there's a paradigm shift. The methods you describe are very labor intensive. As you say, you embedded in these domains for several days, you studied, you spoke to experts, you collected information. We're moving into a world now of agentic systems without people in the loop, where alignment is only one of the many challenges in these AI systems. Take LLM, these are in essence probability machines, right? And despite the formally sound mathematics, their results can be extraordinarily unpredictable and uneven. And it can take considerable human domain expertise to distinguish really appealing hallucinations from truth. And so even for those uncomfortable with equations, I think the methods you describe here in your talk are lucid and accessible. Should we be concerned that as we update those methods to include machine learning algorithms, they'll lose that quality, they'll behave in ways that are as unpredictable as LLM systems can be, that they'll acquire emergent properties that are difficult for us to explain, difficult for you to explain because you can't peek under the hood in a way that you can with your methods? I'm thinking in part of like recent research on recursive introspection, the brittleness of chain of thought reasoning in LLMs. I'm wondering, what should we do with agentic risk models that adapt at faster than human speed, that ingest immense volumes of digital data that are generated daily, that derive new informative features that seem to work, but we don't know why? And you know, it seems that the incentives are favoring movement in that direction. So how do we take, you know, the sterling clarity of what you presented and kind of force it in, and save ourselves from that really murky world?
Yeah, in a decision that really matters, I would never use the results of LLMs without understanding its structure. And to understand its structure, you have to talk to the analysts. You have to ask the analysts who are the experts that have given their opinions that are behind that analysis. And there are lots of cases, medical cases, for example, or government cases, where I do not believe that using the results of artificial intelligence without understanding where it comes from would be, how can I say? I should not say stupid, but I'm going to say it. You don't do that. I mean, you have to understand where the information comes from, where the reasonings come from, and do your best with that. And that's the best I can tell you.
Okay, thank you. Please, if you have questions, raise your hands, and I'll make a list. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, first, thank you for sharing your interesting methodology. I wanted to ask a question about Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns, and how would your model cope with that? I guess my guesstimate from reviewing what you shared is maybe you would tap into the experts perhaps to look at maybe the different failure state analysis of how the system could evolve and what kinds of states it could be in, which could uncover maybe the possibility of an unknown unknown space, but maybe you can give us more details.
You know, I have very seldom really encountered unknown unknowns. I have very often had some information. Not statistical information, nothing perfect, but some information. And that's where I would go to my experts. And if my expert said, we have no clue, we have no idea, then you have to put a uniform distribution of probability on an event. But I have very seldom had to do that. As I said, very often there is some information that is not in the classic statistical format. But there is some information. So you have to transform that information into probabilities and into the kinds of models I'm talking about. And by the way, put your uncertainties in the results. So when you present the results, you have to say to the decision maker, look, here we have a lot of uncertainty. So you have a lot of uncertainty in your decision, and your decision will depend on your risk attitude. But this is the best information I can give you.
I want to take a question from the online audience, and I should have said at the beginning, actually, that this talk is grounded in a recent report that Elisabeth wrote for our program, which is available on our project's website, hoover.org/USCW. But the speaker asks, and perhaps this is part of the answer, what some good introductory texts to the material that you just presented might be, an article for a beginner who wants to get interested in risk analysis. And I would say, well, start with this, but then...
Upstream, there is a book on probability and statistics and decisions by my late husband, Alan Cornell. And that is, I think, a good book to start from if you want to learn about probability and how to use them in decisions. It's the best I can say.
Excellent. Thank you. Please.
So, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I have a basic problem with your presentation, though. You only find what you look for. So, in the anesthesia case, you're looking at the anesthesiologist. I don't see an analysis of predisposing patient factors. I don't see an analysis of the equipment that's used. Second case, tiles. My first thing with an engineering background would be, how about the construction of the tiles? How were they checked? And then you reach a conclusion, paying the technologists more money, that seemed to come out of where? Where did you have data showing that if you pay the technologists more money, you'll get better results? So,
yeah, I'm going to answer your second question. Because they will stay instead of moving. And the experience, they will gain and keep their experience. And what I've observed at Kennedy is that they were moving because they would be making more money next door. And the information and the experience that you have gained is being lost. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, the format and the structure of the example that I presented, on purpose, I restricted it to very well-defined. Now, if you want me to look at the tiles from the design to the manufacturing to the installation, then the maintenance, which is what I focused on, and then when you remove them, which is the next, which you do during maintenance, I can do that too. But my study was focused on the maintenance. That's why I could do it by being at Kennedy Space Center, seeing what they were doing, etc. But again, I've heard a lot about the way they were designed, and I've heard a lot about the alternatives of these tiles. So I could talk about it.
it'd be nice to know what component of all failures are due to the one issue you looked at.
Yes, sir. You're absolutely right, but it was not what I did. It was not my study. It was not what I told NASA I was going to do for them.
When I get the consent form, I'm not going to say, oh, only you're going to deal with whether the resident got enough sleep.
Well, what I'm saying about the anesthesia, it's not the whole problem that I'm treating here. And you know that better than I do. The machines, as you were saying. Now, I looked at the machines first. And what I found is that, in fact, the machines were not a very important part of the problem. The machines were maintained regularly. The important part of the problem were the people. And it was not only the individuals, but the way they were dealing with each other. But I did not look at the way they had been trained, for example. What I looked is what they were doing in the operating room. And that's where, as I said, the nurses were extraordinarily effective in telling me what they were seeing, but they had not seen their training. But, as I said, I was concerned about the young people who were just entering the system. And let's say that surgery for which I had to make a decision, I asked about the anesthetist, and if I found out that it was someone, a resident, and I asked for someone else.
Thank you.
And I did get someone else.
Norbert?
Yeah, so Elizabeth, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. We can take that question even at a higher level. So when you have complex situations, right, like, you model China versus US, whatever, or...
And by the way, I know nothing about that problem, but I
Okay,
will
well,
learn.
pick something else complex.
Yeah.
How do you decide what to include and not to include in the model when you start at the very beginning? You talk about spending time there, talking to people. That's a very individual kind of a taste thing. So is this Elizabeth's taste at the end that decides this is inside the Bayesian model, that's at the start, or it's not? Or is there a strategy or methodology that's applied in terms of what's in and what's out?
It's not the methodology that tells me what is the limit of my problem. Someone has to decide. My customer, the person who is funding my study, is telling me, okay, we want to look at this, but not looking at that.
Well, that's fine,
Elizabeth,
but
you may-
my question is,
the
what is
microphone
it
for the-
that, once you define that boundary, right, the customer says, look at that.
Yes.
How do you decide what's included and what's not? Because there are lots of things that are kind of at the boundary, right? They're
Yeah.
kind of a influence, but it's not so sure that they really have a major
I would
one or
say,
not.
when in doubt, on the edges of the problem, I put the factors in. I look at the factors. And in fact, in several studies, I have given an idea of the result of doing that, okay? But I'm not the one, most of the time, who decides what's going to be the boundaries of the problem. For example, in anesthesia, I was paid by the Anesthesia Foundation. So they wanted to hear about the anesthesia, and we decided with the foundation where the boundaries were. The same thing was true with NASA and the tiles of the shuttle. I did not look at the way they were manufactured. By the way, it's only when I went to Johnson Space Center and talked to a gentleman who had been there forever and was wedded to the tiles that I got an idea of how they had been designed and why they had not picked another design. But it was not part of my study. And it's NASA that had decided of that. So it's a customer that tells me what they want.
I think in our conversations about this work as well, you seek a broad array of experts as well to inform that as well. So
Oh, yes.
presumably there's an
No.
element of crowdsourcing this as well in law of averages.
Yeah. Well, I meet a lot of people in each of those projects. Sir.
On the second space shuttle disaster where falling insulation hit the tiles and caused the disaster, what was your analysis before and after
Oh, yeah.
the flight?
Okay, well, Colombia.
Yeah.
What happened is that some of the insulation of the external tank was not very well attached, particularly along the fuel line. And the fuel line was creating a discontinuity in the surface of the stuff. So parts of that insulation detached, and a piece about this size came to hit the left wing, the edge of the left wing. And it made a hole in the edge of the left wing, and the hot gases penetrated and attacked the subsystems underneath.
And what did you think the probability of that happening was before the flight?
I never compute a probability after a fact. Okay, never do that. Never compute the probability of an accident after it has happened, and because it's one, probability was one, but I have not computed it before the fact, so I cannot tell you. I could if I wanted to, but and it's too late anyway.
So in our online audience, let me put a couple of questions together because I think they fit together well. First, can you say something about the number of person hours involved in any one of these case studies? How intensive, how many hours did it take for you? Because it sounds extremely labor intensive, but also valuable. You get what you put into it, right? But then the second related question is, how do you recommend, what's the best way to validate influence diagrams in models?
Oh, influence diagrams are the most useful shape of model that I've seen, because I put in the influence diagrams all the key variables, and behind the signs that you see, there is a probability distribution. And probability distribution of B conditional on A. So that's my favorite tool, because I can really see what I'm doing. So I use inference diagrams all the time. Now, how long does it take me? I have no idea. How long did it take me to do the tiles risk analysis? I had an assistant, let's say 2 years, 1 to 2 years with a research assistant. So you compute.
Okay.
Given that I was teaching at the same time.
Well, that raises a question that's been in the back of my mind.
Yeah.
Because, well, you know, there's so many, I think, domains in which we could apply these methods. Are there enough Elisabeth Paté-Cornells to go around? Or maybe it's a question of satisficing. How can we upskill or empower people who are already struggling with these problems to apply the kinds of methods that you talk about to improve risk analysis? Maybe not to reach the level to which you've taken it, but to nonetheless get us to a better place.
Let me say first that there are not many risk analysts, and now it's being recognized, and quite a lot of organizations are in fact sending out research for proposals for risk analysis, which I found truly interesting. The Army sends me, many of my PhD students are from US Army, and have been the last 10 years, because it worked for them. And the Army has sent me some of their best people.
How about the Navy?
The Navy, too. There's one Navy, one former Navy officer working with me right now. We need more risk analysts if you want risk analysis, but many people don't understand it, and because they don't understand it, they don't want it. And so it's the wet finger in the wind, and some of it, by the way, is very good. I mean, there are some experts who are going to tell you what they think without a detailed risk analysis, and they will be right because they have had a lot of experience. So for example, a doctor does not need to do a risk analysis to tell me what to do. But I can go back to the statistics to see if I really want to do what that doctor is saying. And it has not always been yes. And so, it's the user who has to decide what to do. It's the person who's going to make the decision, who has to decide whether he or she wants to have a risk analysis based on probability or just, what the experts are telling him or her.
So much of this depends, as you say, on the human dimension. You talk about in the report, for example, the oil rig disaster,
Oh, yes.
right, in the Gulf of Mexico. You talk about anesthesia. How do you go about modeling these human factors? Because human beings can be unpredictable, but then again, probabilistic statistics and Bayesian modeling is, I think, adapted to this.
I have designed a model that has worked very well for me to do exactly that. First, I start with the technical model. So tell me what needs to work for that stuff to work. Then, for each of the variables of this model, I ask the next question, who has his hands on it? And what do they do? What can they do? What mistakes can they make that would affect the probability of failure of that subsystem or component? And then I go one step above to the management of the organization of these people. What incentives, what resources do they get? How are they hired? And how does that affect the probability that they are going to make a human error That's going to affect the reliability of the components and the system that I'm looking at. I was looking at petroleum transportation by ships and the risk of failure in that ship. And so, the ship, the risk of failure, the people who have access to that stuff, have they maintained it properly, designed it properly? And then the management on top of the head, how are they chosen, how they trained, how they paid, etc. And by the way, how they are paid and how long have they been in action and is an important part of the story. Their competence, their experience, so that's why I put it in my model.
I'll give you the last question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for
You have to speak
fantastic.
loud.
Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. My question again kind of goes back to the question of artificial intelligence.
Of what?
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence, yeah.
Yes, and I was just wondering that do you think the field of risk analysis and expertise could be one of the ones that faster or sooner than later will be dominated with the use of artificial intelligence? In a way, the need for human expertise would be replaced more or less, not, sort of all across, but more or less with the help of artificial
Well,
intelligence.
yes, you're right, it could happen, but if you are serious about a difficult decision with outstanding outcomes, you listen to what the AI system has to say, but you open the AI system or you go to see who has designed it. I mean, you look at the AI system before you swallow what it says and you use what it says. So that's all I can tell you. If it's my life or that of my children, I tell you that I will look at the AI system and carefully where it comes from before I use its recommendation.
Thank you very much for a stimulating